Hello to everyone who's watching, and welcome back to CASARI's interview series, where we speak to members of the BU community on the work that they do and how it intersects with anti-racism. Before we get started, we at CASARI want to acknowledge that those of us who are non-Indigenous reside on stolen land, land which was undeniably acquired through the process of systematic genocide and murder of Indigenous communities by European colonialists and settlers, and a process in which non-Indigenous people still profit from today. Most importantly, we want to emphasize that we couldn't do the work that we do without the work that Indigenous activists and leaders have been doing for a long time, going back several decades and even further. Anti-racism stands alongside anti-colonialism, and these two things should never be seen as separate. So my name is V, she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm currently on Mohican and Haudenosaunee land. Mari.
Hello, I'm Mari. Watchers, audience we've met before. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm currently on Pokanock, Pagusset, and Wappinger land. Professor Kibria, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Nazli Kibria. I am a professor of sociology at Boston University, and I am also currently Associate Dean for the Faculty of Social Sciences in CAS.
Okay, so we have like questions that are like more field specific and individual, and then general, which I think you've gotten already. So I guess we'll just start going into them, and we can also go off topic. Like if there's something that you want to talk about that you just think of as we speak, definitely feel free to do that. So our first question is, what drew you to sociology? Like, what is it that you found important about it that you like pursued it?
Right. Well, I grew up in South Asia, in Bangladesh, and I think that I came to the US as a teenager. And I think that, sort of inequality, broadly speaking, was of great concern to me. Inequality in many levels, global. At that time, certainly Bangladesh was a very poor society, but especially as a woman, there were very few opportunities. And sociology was kind of, I admit I fell into it. It was not the only thing I could have done, but I liked how it kind of brought a lot of things together. And it was not sort of a very rigid discipline in the sense of, having a kind of, there is a core orthodoxy, there is in every discipline, but sociology is comparatively fluid and flexible. So you're allowed to use different methods. You can have, very different theories about the social world. So I like that flexibility. And then, as I sort of started studying in college and decided to do my PhD, also I became more involved in issues of immigration, which is one of my main areas of study. And I think, that has been a great focus for me. I look at immigration, immigrants, families, gender relations, and it's brought a lot of things for me together. And through sociology, when I study immigration, I can also do political science. I can do, psychology, I can do literature. So it's, I like the fluidity.
Thank you. Okay, the next question we have is, how can sociology be utilized as a way to practice anti-racism?
Well, I think that, sociology has a lot of tools, conceptual tools that I think have been very important to the body of critical race studies that sort of understands racial structures, concepts like structural racism, colorblind racism. I'm not saying that sociology is the only discipline that's put these ideas together, but it's been a very strong player. And of course, the basic goal of sociology when we teach it, it doesn't matter if it's an intro class or it's an advanced class, it's always the idea of how society is shaping people's actions and thoughts. And I mean, it sounds very trivial, but it's actually a very liberating perspective, especially for people who only have thought about things in very individualistic terms, which is what you have in the US. So, you know, the idea is that racism is just a personal problem of prejudice. I mean, that's all, you know, so, I mean, that's, I don't mean to sort of denigrate that, but that's a very common worldview. And sociology immediately gets at that because it's saying, like, you know, even your emotions, your family life, who you love, everything is kind of, you know, sort of related to these structures. So in that sense, I think that there's a lot there. Where maybe sociology has been more deficient is really in terms of melding that sort of those concepts with practice, you know, with practices of anti-racism. So, you know, as Professor Ibram Kendi talks about in his work. So I think that there has been sort of a gap between, you know, studying, understand. I mean, that is obviously the first step. You need to understand what's going on, but then how do you actually practice those? That I think, you know, sociology maybe has been deficient in that respect.
I think all of that actually kind of leads us into our third question, which works out. But I guess we were wondering how the field of sociology has changed over the years when it comes to things like anti-racism and equity, broadly speaking, but also if you thought that in comparison to other fields, is it adapting well to like the times and what people are calling for, or is it behind like other ones? Because I think we found that speaking to other professors and interacting with other departments, like the English department, the history department, the art history department, a lot of these departments are claiming that they want to work towards things without actually doing the things that they say that they're going to do. So I guess it was interesting. We wanted to find out if sociology was similar or if it was doing things differently.
Well, I think that, you know, I don't sort of mean to be really dramatic, but I think that, you know, within sociology, there are conflicts around this. I mean, there's kind of, and at times it gets very sort of turbulent because, you know, at the core, you have people who have traditionally had a lot of status in the field who kind of have this idea of sociology as science and kind of hands-off. You know, you don't sort of kind of get involved. It's more sort of the detached analyst, observer of social life. And that probably constitutes, like, you know, the high status departments, journals, articles kind of come from that perspective. So then you have, but you have a huge sort of outgrowth now of more people who are engaging in more critical sociology and, you know, also doing a kind of work that is meshed with activism. And the stuff that I am particularly familiar with is kind of community activism. So where sociologists both kind of conduct research and also are, you know, they don't sort of separate that from their activism, community activism. So I think that it's kind of like a lot of things, it's kind of, there's sort of a war going on. And, you know, sometimes I'm not sure who's going to win, where it's going to land, but it's very kind of visible. You know, you see it very clearly in terms of what's going on. There are people who are more sort of clinging to how the discipline has traditionally been defined and measured status and reputation. And then there are people who are trying to kind of, you know, kind of break down some of these barriers.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that, because it's been something that we've kind of come up against time and again in terms of who we can find to reach out to when we do our work. Like, we often find that humanities fields are very open to, maybe they're not actually doing that much change, but at least they'll talk to us and they will be fairly willing to acknowledge that they have some sort of problem. Whereas that we often find that the STEM fields, they're really clinging to this notion of like, this is a science, we don't get political, we don't have those issues, 1 and 1 is 2.
Right.
So our next question is a little bit more is like a segue into what are you currently working on?
Right. Well, what I've been in the dean's office for the past 2 or 3 years, and actually I've been sort of one of the things that I've been helping Stan Sklarov do is to kind of develop diversity and equity DEI initiatives, especially in terms of faculty hiring. That's been one thing. So I've had that part of it, but I'm also an academic. I'm a scholar, so I'm actually I am now, I'm doing a study with a colleague at Brandeis University. Her name's Karen Hansen, and we have been very fortunate. We've been awarded a Gates Foundation Grand Challenge grant for a study called Cascading Lives. And we're looking at basically how people experience economic mobility, downward mobility, and how they recover or don't recover, and and we've been interviewing people in the hospitality industry, and kind of, and of course, we didn't plan it, but this happened during COVID, and the hospitality industry has been, devastated, and so we've been collecting life histories, and the goal is to try and then we're going to present these. We're still working on what form with the Gates Foundation to high schools and get high school students involved in. The basic goal is to try to change narratives of poverty and economic inequality in the US, to try to understand how it's kind of not just one thing, but it's often a cascade, and who cascades depends on what kind of supports they have at what level. So we have someone who lost their restaurant job, but they have a upper middle class parents who can help them out versus someone who doesn't. I mean, that's a very simple example. So I'm sort of I'm sort of in my quote spare time when I'm not doing work in the dean's office. That's what I'm doing.
Okay, our next question is one that I guess I kind of have been thinking about for like a long time, like as a college student, also as like an Asian person, I guess. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. He's excited for no reason. So have you found that there is any intellectual or like experiential conflict between mainland and diasporic Asian people in like your field of study, or even in the classroom between students? Because I found that has like been an issue for people, either like from people I know or at other universities, where our like ideologies and backgrounds don't entirely mesh that well together, and we're like in conflict. And how are we supposed to like not overcome that, but like work through that, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely a point of tension. My impression is that it's it's something that I think has kind of gotten sharper over time in this country, because you had sort of after 1965, you had Asian immigration opening up again, and then now you're starting to see more of people who are second, third generation Asian Americans. And at the same time, I guess especially at BU, but not exclusively, you have international students, you have people who are recent immigrants, and there's bound to be a sort of cultural, sort of a perception of gap there. And I do see it, I do see it. I don't know if I see it sort of so much in my classes, but I get a sense of it around campus, that there's definitely groupings of students, and different perceptions, and like whatever the Asian, I may be saying something that's wrong, but like the Asian student clubs are more oriented towards international, more culture clubs and partying. And, I don't know. I don't know if, you'd have to tell me if some of those divisions, perceptions are wrong. But I think that one way in which this different experience and sort of identity is important is maybe in how people understand race relations and respond to them. I think that's something that probably needs to be talked about more. And it could be that now, with a rise in anti-Asian violence that we've seen recently, that this is going to provide the opening that people need, because anti-Asian violence does not discriminate. If you're a third generation, versus whatever, an international student, it doesn't matter, right? So, those kinds of, shared experiences, in a kind of very unfortunate way, this spike in hate crimes against Asians may be a time when people can really start talking about that, because it's a kind of shared fate, even if people don't want, want that fate. It's kind of like, when there was all the anti-Muslim violence, post 9/11, there were Sikh Americans who are not Muslim, actually, who are getting targeted. They were the victims of hate crimes. So there are times when, the specifics don't matter, that there's kind of a shared situation. So, but I think I've been at BU a long time, and I have to tell you that before I came to BU, which was in the 1990s, my first job out of grad school was at the University of Southern California in LA. And I was also I have a book. My second book is called Becoming Asian American, which is a study of middle class, second generation Chinese and Korean Americans. And at that time, I helped to start their American Studies program, which was actually sort of ethnic studies. And there was like an Asian American Studies kind of track in that. And I got to BU, and this was a long time ago in the 90s. It was kind of the post-Silber era. But, it was a context where I could not imagine teaching like a course on Asian Americans. It was not, there was no support for it from the administration, and there was no apparent student interest either. So I remember how jarring that was, at that time, to come from Southern California and come to BU. I went off, sorry.
No, that was excellent. And you kind of went into something that we've talked a lot about at CASARI, which is the kind of founding of an ethnic studies center at BU, because it's something that we still don't have. And we still see a huge lack in terms of studies for Asian Americans, for Latinx Americans, for Indigenous peoples. So we want to keep this conversation about the Ethnic Studies Center going and very healthy. So that way, maybe, the administration will start to listen. Our next question is, can you speak on any notable Asian thinkers or figures in the field of sociology that you think people should know about?
Yeah, sure. So let's see, there are a lot. Trying to think of what there is a scholar, and her name is Dina Okamoto. She is now at Indiana University, Dina Okamoto, and she is, I think, a very important voice in sociology of Asian American studies. And she has a book, a 2014 book called Redefining Race, Asian Americans and Shifting Ethnic Boundaries. And I think that's a really interesting book. So another person would be Yen Espiritu at the University of California, San Diego, who's written a lot. I think her latest work is on Filipino Americans and histories of colonialism and settlement. So those are some of the people that I think of. And there are many others. It's in the American Sociological Association, there's a section called Asia and Asian America. And it's a very sort of lively and vibrant subfield. But in that field also, one of the reasons why I was maybe struggling to answer you immediately is that it's very interdisciplinary. So like if you ask me like who's the most, what are some of the most prominent works, thinkers, I would think of people from history, Erica Lee, who writes about a historian who writes about Chinese Exclusion Act. So it kind of, it's a field that sort of encompasses all kinds of, different thinkers, which is the great thing about it.
Okay, so I guess we can move into, thank you, first of all. I think that's what we've been trying to do at CASARI. Like me and Mari were just talking about this, how we kind of want to like compile resources and like places for people to go so that they can like learn things when they're not getting, like hypothetically not getting the like education that they thought they were going to get when it comes to like intersectionality and things like that. Because I think that's been an ongoing issue for a lot of students. So it's nice to hear about different people that are doing different work that we might not be learning about in the class.
One thing, if I can say, is that is one thing I often hear from faculty is if we offered it, would there be any students taking it? Right. I often hear that, and I was just curious to see what you think, especially in this economy, and there's a good reason for it. Computer science is, for example, the most popular major, and there are good reasons for it, and like econ. And if I were to offer Asian American studies or something next year, would there be student interest? Is there? We always look at enrollments in the dean's office. I was curious if you had any thoughts about that.
I can say from my own experience that, well, first of all, this is a question that we've gotten like actually a lot from faculty and from like deans and people like, oh, are students interested? And I think the fact that we're like here and like talking about it shows that there is like a lot of interest. That I think what goes on a lot of the times, like a lot of not even miscommunication, just a complete lack of communication. Because I've found that a lot of classes, like professors will be like, oh, we want to do this class, we tried running it and people didn't sign up. But then when you talk to like students, they didn't even know that class was being offered. Like it wasn't advertised in a way that made it super accessible or like visible to a lot of people. And from my experience, when I came to BU like freshman year, I with Professor Rivera ran Asian American Lit. And I think I don't think he like, I'm not sure if he created the class or if he brought it back after a really long time, but that class was full. And I've heard that every like semester after that, so that was like 3 years ago, it's been full like ever since. And he's been developing a lot of courses that are like have to do with issues of like race, gender, things like that, and people are interested. I think that I think another thing that happens is that there's like this invisible target audience that like administrators have when they think about developing these classes, and they're like, oh, students won't be interested. But that often comes down to, oh, white students won't be interested, and because they're the majority of people on campus, that means that, oh, then no one is interested. But there are a lot of like students of color who are and do want to take these kinds of classes, but like just because we end up being in the minority, it looks like no one is like interested. But if these things were more accessible, I think more people would want to join them, is what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
and maybe a sort of better integration with these hub requirements, right?
Yes,
Which people
yes,
have to
yes.
take
Yeah.
anyway. Yeah.
That was something I brought up with the English department, because I used to be an English major until I left because it was making me really miserable, like as a person. Because I think that a lot of these kinds of courses should be mandatory. Like, I don't know why we're not like having to learn about, like, for example, like African American like writers as like a required part of like the English major, as if that's not a part of like the English tradition or like the American tradition or something. I think it has a lot to do with what people see as like the canon, I guess, and like what people think defines the like major or defines the field, which I have huge issues with, and I think other people do too. So that's something that's been going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this leads into the next general question. So what has support from faculty or administration looked like when it comes to your own scholarship / interests, particularly when it comes to issues of race and other inequalities? And how would you want support to look if you could have it like in any way? Big question, I know. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll take the last part first, which is, what support would look like, and I think there are moves in this direction, is that more opportunities to teach courses on race and sort of inequalities more generally. Oftentimes we get stuck in, there's a particular sequence of courses for each major, and then you need faculty to teach those courses, which are, so, I think that, obviously maybe some of those requirements could be redefined, and that's part of the battle. But the other thing is that, for most of my sort of career at BU, I didn't have a whole lot of choice, in the sense, I didn't have some choice, but, there were certain courses that had to get covered, right? Basic courses. So, to the extent that those are sort of made more available, more possible, I think that would be good. And to create some, really fantastic revolutionary courses on anti-racism, inequality, targeted courses. You also need to give people chances to co-teach, at least in the beginning. And that hasn't been very easy at BU for all kinds of reasons. So that, that's kind of, and I feel like once you do it, it doesn't need to be a permanent thing, but you often kind of need that spark, often to kind of develop something that's kind of really, really sort of new. So there's that. That's how I think, that's what I think support would look like. And what sort of support have I gotten? I think that's a tough question for me to answer, because like I said, I've been at BU so long, mid-90s, and when I entered the sociology department, if you said gender, people had like, thought you were doing something, like the revolution. So, it's, it's, I had no support. I had, yeah, but that's not, I don't think it's useful for me to go into that history. But it's, I think in more recent years, there's been a lot of support. I've been able to teach courses in my area, sociology of a migration, which is great. I've gotten funds to lead a migration workshop in which we bring in speakers and students and faculty. It's interdisciplinary on issues related to immigration. So those are all good things. And, as an AD, associate dean, there really has been a sort of genuine effort on the part of the CAS Dean's office to do more. So it's kind of a mixed, but yeah, there's still a lot more to do for sure.
Thank you. The next question is, in an ideal world, what would your department or field look like? What do you think is critically missing from the mainstream?
Well, it sounds very general, but I think that the prestige in the field it still goes to certain types of work, that people who are asking certain types of questions, and the highest ranked journals in our field, the American Sociological Review, for example, it tends to favor, very statistical, quantitative studies that are very kind of traditional in their methods, or they are extremely theoretical. There's no sort of attention to, there's not very much prestige. If I was, the study that I just described to you on how hospitality workers are sort of whatever, coping or cascading, that's not the way of framing a topic that would really get me into a top journal. So it's, and that's a disconnect between sort of, public needs, because what we need to do is change the narrative of how people think about economic inequality. And that's not going to be done by publishing in, the American Sociological Review. So I guess what I'm saying is that I wish there was the better bridge with public scholarship. And, we search for stuff that is sociology that we can assign in our classes, not because students are dumb, because you want, you want something that people can read, right? So that bothers me a lot. There's a sort of, kind of lack of democracy there, when there's a production of so much knowledge, which oftentimes doesn't have to be so specialized. It can be written and produced in more accessible ways.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because there seems to be, when we speak to people, there's like two conflicting like perspectives when it comes to stuff like that. Like, we need material that's like accessible and that everyone can read, so we're not like gatekeeping people as they're sitting inside the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
But then we've had like other people tell us that like we shouldn't necessarily have to do that, and I don't know what that meant. Like, I didn't get a chance to ask them what that meant, and so I don't know if that's like similar to what you're saying, how it's like we're not assuming that students are like dumb, like we're giving them material we think they can handle. But I have been in like classrooms where they did give us materials that we actually couldn't handle, and then like we kind of not wasted, but we spent a lot of class time trying to go over something that maybe could have been explained in like easier terms. So I guess like that kind of balance is hard to reach sometimes, but I lean toward accessibility because I think that, I don't know, I would just like to leave a classroom and know that I learned at least one thing that day and not be like confused about literally everything. But
yeah, I mean, it's definitely a matter of balance. I mean, because
yeah.
it's, people want to challenge students, which they should. But I mean, it's more this kind of idea of kind of keeping knowledge bounded, like, inaccessible, which is, how professions basically kind of gain status. Like, it's only us who can do this. Yeah.
So this is another question, and this is a question that we like to ask because the responses are pretty interesting when we do ask them. In what ways have you seen, and I think people are afraid of this phrasing or this like these words, but like, in what ways have you seen white supremacy manifest on both a university-wide and a departmental level?
Yeah, I can see why this would be a a difficult question to answer. I mean, I guess, because partly for me, it's because it's everywhere. So it becomes very hard to kind of pin down and define. So let's see, how long ago was it? It's been a while. In 2000 and from starting in 2012, 2011, I became chair of the Department of Sociology, right? And I went into my first meeting of the chairs. You know, they have these meetings, the chairs in CAS, they all get together and the dean leads the meeting. And they were all, I mean, maybe there was one woman in a group of 62, and there were like no people who were not white. And, you know, I think that one of the ways in which white supremacy, you know, in the institution has been embedded is through the leadership. You know, is through how leadership is kind of chosen and treated. And, you know, I do have to say in that respect, in 2021, all of the chairs in my division, I think right now, are women. And I see more and more different kinds of people when I look around the room in CCD meetings. But I mean, that's certainly part of it. But the other part of it is, you know, there's a sort of cultural atmosphere, which is very hard to kind of pin, you know, put your finger on, which is definitely part of the institution. I've felt it throughout. I feel it now. I mean, I feel it now in sort of my interactions with people and the way that meetings are run. So there's that, and there's also the structures. And by structures, what do I mean? You know, I think like BU was very concerned about, you know, they evaluate departments for how highly departments are ranked, you know, according to these measures, you know, that are been constructed of how, you know, who is the #1 political science department in the country or in the world, Stanford or Oxford, and you get placed in this kind of, you know, numerical rank. And you know, it makes a difference in terms of how departments I mean, it's not the only criteria or ingredient, but certainly it has been part of the calculus in terms of how departments are and their faculty are viewed and treated and kind of nurtured. And, you know, to me, that is part of a white supremacist structure, because a lot of the ways that those have been constructed, they value a particular type of work and engagement, and it gets reinforced by the institution, you know, when they rely on those measures. So, you know, I think that for a place like BU right now in 2021, and BU's not alone, other higher education institutions, there really needs to be a reckoning of what good scholarship and good teaching is and what status and reputation means. Because as an academic, I mean, that's kind of what we worry about all the time. Am I, you know, the stat, you know, how my work is being received? Am I getting those awards and those fellowships? And, you know, how does my department rank and all those kinds of things? So I think those, and maybe COVID will kind of shift our thinking a bit. I don't know. But for me, those things are all connected.
Thank you for that response, because I think it's different. It relates to, but it's also different than some of the other ones that we've gotten. And also, thank you for bringing up the point about the ranking and the departments. Like, I did not know that was the case. It almost sounds like the SATs. Like, this is the only thing we evaluate you on, but like, it's gonna make it or break it either way.
I mean, it's not the only thing. So, you know, someone could go after me. There are other things, but it is important.
But it's important,
like
right?
The SATs, like, yeah.
Like, it's, you know, it's not everything, but it's still important, right? So you end up worrying about it anyways. And also, just like when you were talking about how our work is evaluated and what's expected of people on all levels of the college, you know, I think about it more and more, and how in so many ways it's not healthy, and it makes us focus on things that it's important to focus on sometimes, but not as much. So I questioned it a lot. I questioned that aspect of white supremacy and how it dictates how systems work and how evaluations are made a lot, because I find it to be more and more toxic the more I think about it. So I think the next question that we have kind of relates. So which professors or what classes in particular within the Department of Sociology do you feel are best suited for students looking for a more intersectional approach to the discipline?
That is one question that I want to take a pass on, because I love my colleagues in my department, and I think almost, not all, but almost all of the classes will give you that, some of that, so that's kind of one thing. I mean, because whether it's health, whether it's like family, it's people are kind of grappling with those those intersectional qualities and inequalities. So I would kind of prefer not to answer that.
Okay, we have this question, and it's a happy question. So this is a more
Good.
happier.
Good.
Yeah, good. So in your future work, is there anything that you are interested in studying? And I guess like in tandem with that, what kind of courses would you like to teach if you were able to?
Yeah, well, I still think that I would love to teach a course on the sociology of Asian Americans. I haven't done that in years. And that would be an exciting thing for me to do. I'm currently sort of, besides the work that I described to you about hospitality workers and COVID, I'm also doing a project that is, it sounds a little strange on the surface, but it's not once you hear what it is. So it's about adult siblings. So I've been interviewing with students, have been helping me interview people who have ended up in very different places in terms of their social economic status as adults, although they grew up together. And through that we're sort of looking at how people, not just the trajectory of what has happened in their life, that's part of it, and why they've ended up in different places, but also how they understand what has happened. So someone who ends up as a lawyer, someone who ends up as a, whatever, cook in a restaurant. I mean, how do they explain their circumstances, and how do they relate to each other? So I'm basically sort of looking at social distance, and social distance unfortunately has taken on a particular meaning in this COVID pandemic. But what I'm talking about is class distance, particular, and how that's bound up also with cultural distance. So it's about siblings. I'm partly a family sociologist, and I think siblings are an understudied relationship. We don't know that much about it. And I'm using that relationship partly to look at class, the dynamics of social class, and across different groups, different racial, ethnic groups. And there's also a global component to the study that I'm hoping to get into. So, yeah.
Yes, Mari, did you?
I was thinking that could be our last question, because it would be ending on a happy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you. It was super interesting to hear about stuff, because I'm not even sure if I've taken a sociology class at BU or in a really long time. Really, really long time. So it's interesting now because of everything that's been going on, I think.
But, yeah. I mean, there's some really good professors, faculty.
Yeah, some of my favorite professors are from the sociology department, like some of the best classes I've taken, because I took a sex and social life class last semester, and I super enjoyed it. It was one of the first times that I was in the classroom and I felt like A, safe, and B, like we were learning about something that was relevant to me. I often feel very detached from what I've been taught. So yeah, sociology's is quite cool. And also, I will say that we've heard from other departments, people will be like, oh yeah, you know, the people at sociology, they're doing things over there. Like, I think it's a department that's looked up to by other departments.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah. And it just so, I mean, it doesn't have to be the case, but a lot of our majors have, you know, often been students of color. I mean, they gravitate there because I think, because it is a space where they feel like they're hearing something relevant. So it's not uncorrelated.